to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberly, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. There's something uniquely disorienting about losing a parent. Because whether the relationship was loving, complicated, distant, close, nurturing, fractured, stable, inconsistent, parents often hold a very specific place in our emotional world. They are connected to our beginnings, our childhood, our identity, our family history, and the earliest version of ourselves. And I think parent loss can feel so profound because it often shifts something much deeper than people realize at first. It's not only the loss of a person, it's the loss of someone tied to the foundation of your life story, someone connected to where you came from, to memories nobody else witnessed in quite the same way, to your younger self. Even as adults, there's often still a part of us that emotionally exists in relationship to our parents, a part that still feels like their child. And when a parent dies, that can create a kind of emotional disorientation that's difficult to explain unless you've lived it. Because suddenly, someone who always existed in the background of your life story is no longer physically here. And I think people sometimes underestimate how much emotional structure parents can hold in our lives, even when relationships are imperfect. For some people, a parent represented safety, guidance, comfort, home. For others, the relationship may have carried pain, instability, inconsistency, or emotional wounds. But even then, there is often still attachment, hope, history, longing, the possibility that someday things could feel different. When that person dies, there can be a grief not only for who they were, but for everything emotionally connected to them, the role they played, the role you played in relation to them, the conversations that will never happen, the questions you never asked, the healing that may never come. Parent loss can also force people to confront time in a very real way, because when parents die, many people suddenly become aware of their own aging and mortality too. The passing of generations, the realization that life is continuing forward whether we feel emotionally ready or not, and that awareness can feel incredibly heavy. I think one of the hardest things about parent loss is that people often expect it to fit into a very specific narrative, especially if your parent was older. People will say things like, well, they lived a long life. At least you had them for a long time, or this is part of life, you knew this was coming someday. And while those things may be logically true, they don't take away the emotional impact of the loss, because grief is not measured by logic, it's measured by connection. And connection between parents and children is often incredibly layered, even in adulthood. Because parents are usually connected to some of the deepest emotional patterns in our lives, the ways we learned love, safety, conflict, worthiness, belonging. And when a parent dies, those emotional layers often rise to the surface too. For some people, losing a parent feels like losing their emotional anchor. For others, it feels like losing unresolved possibilities, and for many, it's both at the same time. I think one of the reasons parent grief can feel so complicated is because people often assume grief should only contain love. But parent-child relationships are rarely that simple. Some people lose parents they adored deeply. Some lose parents they spent years trying to heal from. Some grieve nurturing relationships. Some grieve emotional absence. Some grieve abuse. Some grieve what never existed in the first place, and all of those experiences are valid forms of grief. Sometimes people feel guilty because they experience relief after a parent dies, especially if caregiving, addiction, abuse, illness, or emotional pain were involved. And that relief can feel deeply confusing because relief and grief can coexist. Love and pain can coexist. Missing someone and feeling angry at them can coexist, and I think more people experience that complexity than we openly talk about. There can also be grief tied to identity because when parents die, people sometimes lose access to parts of their family story. Questions go unanswered, memories disappear, family dynamics shift, and suddenly there's this realization that certain pieces of your history now only exist inside of you. I think one of the deepest parts of parent loss is losing the people who knew you first, the people connected to your childhood voice, your earliest fears, your first experiences, your younger self before life shaped you further. Even when relationships evolve over time, parents are often witnesses to the beginning of your existence. They remember who you were as a child, what made you laugh, what scared you, the stories nobody else remembers in the same way. And when they're gone, there can be this strange and painful feeling of becoming untethered from parts of your own history. Because parents carry memories that no one else does, family stories, moments from before you can even remember yourself. And after they're gone, people sometimes realize that entire chapters of family history disappeared with them. There's also something emotionally profound about realizing there is no longer someone in the world who knew you from the very beginning. Someone who knew your original family system, your childhood environment, your early identity before adulthood transformed you. And even if the relationship was complicated, that shift can feel enormous. I think this is why parent loss can sometimes make people feel emotionally younger again, suddenly reconnecting to childhood memories, old wounds, early attachment patterns, because grief often pulls us backward emotionally before we can move forward again. And I think many people underestimate how deeply tied our sense of self can be to being someone's child, even in adulthood, even after years of independence. There is still often a psychological connection to being witnessed by the people who knew us first. And when that witnessing disappears, it can create a very deep sense of emotional loneliness. I also really want to spend time talking about complicated parent grief, because this is something so many people carry quietly and often feel ashamed to talk about. Not everyone loses a parent they felt safe with. Not everyone loses a parent who loved them in healthy ways. Not everyone gets closure. And not everyone feels only sadness after a parent dies. Sometimes people lose parents who caused enormous pain. Parents who were emotionally unavailable, abusive, addicted, neglectful, critical, unpredictable. And when that parent dies, the grief can become incredibly confusing, because you may not only be grieving the person, you might be grieving the relationship you wished existed, the childhood you needed, the apology that never came, the healing that never happened, the hope you carried for things to someday feel different. And I think this kind of grief can feel especially isolating because society tends to romanticize parent-child relationships. People often expect uncomplicated love, gratitude, devotion, without understanding how many people carry deep wounds from childhood. So when someone feels anger, relief, numbness, resentment, or confusion after losing a parent, they may judge themselves harshly for it. But emotional complexity does not make grief less real. It makes it human. I also think people sometimes underestimate how deeply children continue seeking parental love even into adulthood, even after pain, even after disappointment. There is often still a part of the nervous system looking or hoping for repair, hoping for acknowledgement, hoping for connection. And when death removes that possibility forever, there can be enormous grief in that realization. Because sometimes parent grief isn't only mourning who someone was, sometimes it's mourning who they were never able to become. And those losses deserve compassion too. Another thing people don't always talk about when it comes to parent loss is how much it can change your role in the family, especially as you get older. Because when a parent dies, there is often this quiet shift that happens emotionally. Suddenly, you may no longer feel like the child in the same way. Even if you are fully grown, even if you've been independent for years, for many people, there's this strange realization that the people above you in the family structure disappear. And that awareness can feel incredibly vulnerable. Because parents often represent guidance, history, protection, continuity, even when relationships were imperfect. And when they're gone, people sometimes describe feeling emotionally exposed in a new way, like there's less separation between them and mortality itself. Sometimes parent loss also changes practical family roles. Suddenly you might become the oldest generation left, the decision maker, the organizer, the caretaker, the one younger family members look to for answers or support. And those shifts can feel incredibly heavy while you're grieving yourself, because grief doesn't pause responsibility. Life often keeps moving while people are emotionally trying to process enormous change. There's also grief in realizing certain traditions, dynamics, or eras of the family may never feel the same again. Sometimes a parent was the person who hosted holidays, who kept everyone connected, who carried the family stories and held emotional space for others. And after they're gone, families sometimes shift dramatically. Relationships change, people drift apart, certain gatherings stop happening. And people may find themselves grieving not only the parent, but the entire emotional atmosphere connected to them. I think parent loss can also create identity shifts internally, because many people unconsciously organize parts of themselves around being someone's child. And when that changes, there can be this quiet process of asking, who am I now? How do I move through life without this person existing in it physically? How do I carry both grief and adulthood at the same time? I want to share something personal here too, because I think complicated parent grief is something many more people experience than we openly talk about. My mom struggled with alcoholism, and losing her brought up so many layered emotions for me. There was grief, but there was also guilt. There were moments where I replayed things in my mind, wondering, could I have done more? Could I have helped differently? Should I have handled certain things another way? And I think when addiction is part of the story, people often carry enormous guilt after loss, even when they were never truly responsible for saving that person. There can also be grief for the relationship you wished you would have had, the version of the parent you hoped might someday emerge if things got better. And when someone dies, that possibility dies too. And that can be incredibly heartbreaking in its own way. I think one of the hardest parts of complicated parent grief is learning how to hold compassion for someone's pain while also acknowledging the impact their choices had on you. And both can be true at the same time. You can love someone deeply and still carry hurt from the relationship. You can miss them and still grieve what was broken. You can feel tenderness and anger together, and none of that makes your grief less real. When it comes to parent loss, I don't think healing comes from forcing yourself to feel only one thing about the relationship. And honestly, I think one of the most healing things people can do is allow complexity to exist without judging themselves for it. Because grief is rarely emotionally neat, especially with parents. Sometimes what helps is allowing yourself to tell the truth about the relationship, not the polished version, not the socially acceptable version, but the honest version, the loving parts, the painful parts, the confusing parts, the things you miss, the things you don't miss. Because pretending relationships were simpler than they were often keeps people emotionally stuck. For some people, what helps is sharing stories, cooking recipes their parent used to make, listening to music connected to them, looking through photographs, saying their name, allowing memories to continue existing openly. And for others, what helps is grieving the things they never received. Giving themselves permission to acknowledge unmet needs, childhood wounds, disappointment, longing, without feeling guilty for it. Because healing doesn't always come from idolizing someone. Sometimes it comes from finally seeing the relationship clearly and compassionately. I also think what helps is understanding that grief can awaken older wounds, especially parent grief. People might suddenly reconnect to childhood memories, attachment patterns, old pain, younger emotional parts of themselves. And that can feel overwhelming if they don't understand why it's happening. But grief often reopens emotional rooms we thought we had already closed. Sometimes what helps most is having spaces where grief can be honest, not rushed, not minimized, not compared. Because parent loss can bring up emotions people feel afraid to admit out loud. And I think people deserve spaces where all of that complexity can safely exist. So if you're listening to this while grieving a parent, I really want you to know your grief does not have to look like everyone else's. You do not have to perform closeness. You do not have to minimize your pain. And you do not have to explain why this loss affects you the way it does. If your relationship was loving, you are allowed to miss them deeply. If your relationship was painful, you're allowed to grieve that too. And if your grief feels conflicted or layered, that does not make it less valid. You are allowed to mourn what existed, what didn't, what almost happened, and what never got the chance to heal. All of that belongs here too. You are also allowed to feel emotions that don't seem to make sense together: love and anger, relief and sadness, compassion and resentment. These emotional contradictions are often part of complicated grief, not evidence that something is wrong with you. And if guilt is part of your grief, I hope you offer yourself gentleness around that too. Because so many people carry guilt after parent loss, especially when addiction, illness, estrangement, or conflict existed. But grief has a way of rewriting the past in our minds, making us search for ways we could have somehow changed the outcome. And sometimes part of healing is slowly accepting that loving someone does not mean you had the power to save them from everything. Before we close today, I think it's important to remember that parent loss often reconnects us to much younger parts of ourselves, the child inside us, the version of us that still wanted comfort, protection, understanding, love, even long after childhood ended. Sometimes grief after parent loss isn't only about the present moment. Sometimes it's grief echoing backward through an entire lifetime of memories, wounds, hopes, experiences, and that can feel incredibly heavy to carry. But I also think there's something deeply human about continuing to love imperfect people, about carrying both tenderness and truth at the same time, about acknowledging complexity without needing to erase love completely. And wherever your relationship existed on that spectrum, I hope you allow yourself compassion for it, for the pain, for the longing, for the confusion, for the memories, for the parts that felt beautiful and for the parts that hurt, because all of those experiences can coexist inside grief. Sometimes losing a parent isn't only grieving who they were, sometimes it's grieving who they couldn't become, what the relationship needed, what never healed, and the part of your story connected to that. And when the people connected to your beginning are gone, it can change the way you carry your own story forever. I just want to sit with that for a moment and invite you to close your eyes and settle into your body. Reminding yourself that you don't have to solve any of this today. Just be aware of what is affecting you. And I want to invite you to take one slow, grounding breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Letting go of anything that may feel painful that got brought up today for you. And instead focusing on the love that exists there. I hope you take that love with you when you leave this podcast today. And that you understand you don't have to carry something this heavy alone. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.